Okay, hello everyone. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about drawing the feet. And before we move any further, I just want to preface this video by saying that I'm not necessarily going to be talking about drawing hyper-realistic feet. These are all very simplified interpretations of the foot, but nonetheless, they are indeed drawings of feet. So with that, let's just get right into 3 simple tips for drawing feet. Coming in at number 1 is use a pear to draw the foot. So what do I mean exactly by use a pear? Well, I find that whenever I'm drawing a foot from the front, the shape that I typically use is a shape that looks a lot like this. And looking at this, I don't know about you of course, but to me this shape just kind of looks like a pear. So as funny as that sounds, this actually is the extent of the entire tip. Literally draw a pear and you've essentially drawn the foot. And to be honest, this comes from just looking at lots of references and other artists' work and realizing that this is just a very common shorthand for drawing the foot and it hasn't failed me yet. So when I just roll with that visual analogy, I find that drawing the foot becomes a lot easier even when drawing it at different angles if I just stick to that pear analogy, that mental footnote, if you will. And here in these 3 drawings, that pear shape is going to be front and center as the shape that we drew initially. So again, it's really kind of as simple as that. We draw a pear shape like this, and you've basically drawn debatably the hardest part of the foot when drawing it at this angle. And what's neat about this approach as well is if you take that initial pear shape and flip it upside down, it also acts as the general shape of a foot from underneath it. And so all of these examples here are just to demonstrate how sticking to that pear motif may make it easier to visualize the contour of the foot even from different angles, as when we flip it upside down, it still just looks like a pear. And finally, here are some examples where the pear shape is admittedly a bit stretched and maybe starting to look like a spoiled pear, but nonetheless, a pear is still what I see. Now, before I move on to my next tip, I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. Skillshare is just a one-stop shop for learning about nearly anything you've ever had an interest in, with literally hundreds and hundreds of classes led by industry professionals in fields like photography, film, illustration, and tons more. Right? You want to learn how to build a chair? Get on Skillshare. You want to learn how to cut your own hair? Get on Skillshare. And speaking of pears, you want to learn how to paint a pear? Exactly, you get the idea, you're smart. Now see, me personally, my forte has always been in decisive line drawing, draftsmanship, and that sort of thing, but I've always had an interest in painting, and specifically portraiture. Even on YouTube, there are so many videos, so many angles, and so many keys to a good portrait that it was just always hard for me to know if I'm progressing in the right direction. And in fact, all I wanted was a bit of direction. Well, see, luckily for me, Skillshare has an abundance of classes on painting a portrait in all kinds of styles and in all kinds of mediums. For me, since I draw and Procreate, I landed on this great class by Emma Gillette, and I hope that I'm saying that last name right. And just by watching her process, I was able to go from portraits that looked like this to portraits that looked more like these. As we all know, knowledge is priceless, and for now I mean that literally, because the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. So click that link and get yourself learnt today. Alright, so moving on to tip number 2, use triangles to draw the feet. So this tip is also fairly simple in its concept, and the idea is that by drawing two triangles like this that are connected at the corners, you will have actually drawn a simplified rendition of the foot. The triangle in red will represent the heel, and the one in blue will represent basically the front of the foot. And that rectangular shape in yellow will represent the part of the foot that connects to your lower leg. Now, one thing I want to point out about these triangles is to try and avoid drawing a triangle that's about equal on each side and to use more of a scalene triangle where there is more of a slope to it. And so again, the idea here is to just draw a triangle and to, at this lower corner, draw another triangle like this, and you'll have the majority of the foot already down. All that's left to do from here is to connect the top of these two triangles like this, and you'll have a shorthand for drawing feet. Now, the reason I don't like to draw a triangle that looks about equal on all sides is because if I do this, I find that it'll start to look more like a hoof than an actual human foot. Which is why I like to use different sizes for these triangles to really emphasize that downward slope of the foot. Now, this same technique can be used even for a front view of the foot or even a foot rotated to the side. The process I like to use for angles like these are to just draw the top portion of the foot first and then draw the two triangles after. To me, this is just a really easy technique that produces a consistent result for drawing the feet that goes a long way whenever you're trying to draw quickly or just simply without getting lost in the details. You can even play around with the sizes of these triangles to get different silhouettes for the feet that you draw. Now, if you ever find yourself using this technique but still find that your drawings are leaning towards that hoof-like territory, one adjustment that you can make to this technique is, instead of drawing the triangle for the heel connecting directly to this one like this, draw just a simple line coming off of that lower corner like this and nothing more, just that simple diagonal line. Then from here at the end of that line is where you'll draw that triangle for the heel. And hopefully you'll be able to see that just with that tiny adjustment, it really adds a level of depth to the foot by further separating the heel from that front triangle and captures a more natural look to the drawing. It also helps by making a clearer separation of the shapes used to draw the foot. Now, what specifically makes this a great adjustment is that it captures the natural rhythm of the foot, which is this S-curve-like gesture of the inner foot. This gesture is also commonly called the arc of the foot. Coming in at number 3 is to be mindful of the fat pads of the feet. So in my video about drawing hands, I spoke about using the fat pads of the hand to your advantage in that just by placing those shapes first, it would give you the overall shape of the hand that would allow you to just connect the empty space between those shapes, and it would, in result, it would give you this, albeit simple, but a drawing of a hand. So this last tip is actually exactly the same, because just like the hands, the feet have their own pads of fat that we can use in exactly the same way to draw them. On a real foot, these pads of fat can be found here at what we call the ball of the foot, one here right beside that runs slightly down the length of the foot, and one on the heel. This will consist of the general makeup of these shapes as far as their placement, since the placement of these shapes is what's primarily the most important. And so just like the hands, once I put these shapes down in this configuration, all I have to do is connect the empty space between them and it will give me the shape of a foot. And so just to kind of get like a proof of concept, if we fill this entire drawing in black so as to create just a silhouette, you'll see that we have created a readable representation of a foot. Just like the tip with hands, this works exactly the same way, and that just by placing the shapes of those fat pads in that specific configuration, it allows me to draw feet consistently without having to think too hard about all the bumps and everything else. And actually, you'll even be able to see that the natural silhouette that these shapes make will look just like the average footprint. Which of course can be further emphasized by drawing backwards in a way, by laying the silhouette flat and drawing on top of it. You'll see that by following that shape, we can still draw a fairly accurate interpretation of the foot. And all of this can be derived just from those 3 fat pads on the foot. One other thing about the foot that you'll notice in many drawings is this simplified crease that runs across the foot that becomes visible whenever the foot is bent or just in certain angles. Well, that crease can actually be placed just by following the outer contour that the fat pads of the foot create. You'll see that the fat pads actually sit right on top of that crease, and this may help you whenever you're trying to figure out where on the foot to place that crease as well as where it curves and bends. In this example, you'll see that the same line that we used for that crease actually runs directly on top of the lines I used to describe the fat pads of the foot. So with that, it makes it easier for me to trust that I'm putting that crease in more or less the correct spot if I just follow the placement of those fat pads. Another good way to spot where to place that crease is just by identifying the pinch of the foot and drawing a diagonal line across the foot from that same point. This will kind of just create the illusion that the foot is folding over on itself. And that is going to conclude my 3 tips for drawing feet. Moving on now, I'd like to take a moment, of course, to thank my incredible patrons over on Patreon for all of their support. I have another question this time around. Doggeroni wrote in and said, Emilio, do you read comics? Favorite artists? And yeah, I have read comics actually in the past. I've read, I think, the entire run of Ultimate Spider-Man by Brian Michael Bendis that ran from 2001, I think, to 2009. I've also read Ultimate Comics Spider-Man, which was Miles Morales' like introductory sort of run of comics, again by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pichelli. And I've also read the original run of Spider-Man comics by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, so just a ton of Spider-Man. I have read other comics that just aren't coming to my head right now. Invincible, I read Invincible, I guess at least most of it. And as far as favorite artists go, I have to tip my hat over to Steve Ditko. I think his work on that Amazing Fantasy, that original run, is just an absolute gold mine, and he's just a legend in my book. But that's going to do it for today's video. A special thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and a special thanks to you as always for watching. So stay healthy out there, draw some feet, and I'll talk to you guys very soon.